Hey everyone, welcome back. I've got a special one for you today, a conversation that's been long in the making and close to my heart. I'm joined by Jo'el Adifon, who has become a good buddy of mine these last couple years and very influential on my own evolving perspectives and practices regarding magic and the pathway of Jesus. So Joel is delightfully spiritually amphibious. He breathes the air and the water of so many different streams of Christianity, of ancestral wisdom, African traditional religion, occult inquiry, and outrageous magic with equal fluency as well as deep reverence. So Joel is a blurred and ecstatic, a thaumaturgo in training, and he helps people remember their sacred weirdness and reclaim their connection to the unseen, whether that's through communion with saints, contact with angels, or honoring the ancestors. His work is grounded, often hilarious, and deeply transformative. So, in this conversation, really excited, we're going to talk about what magic really is, how to reapproach Jesus after religious disillusionment, how to know when a spirit's really on your side, and why sacred mischief is often closer to holiness than solemnity. So, whether you come from a Christian background, a magical one, or something else entirely, I think you're going to find both beauty and challenge here. And at the end, Joel is going to share a little bit about his upcoming event, Fun is Risen, a magical convocation that's equal parts resurrection riot and spiritual renewal. So, all right, let's take a breath, open your heart, and enjoy this ride. Here's Joel. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, of course. So, Joel, there are so many interesting ways to describe elements of who you are. For my viewers and listeners who might not be familiar, what is a thaumaturgo?
Okay, so a taumaturgo is basically it's Italian and derived from Greek for wonder worker. And the term originally came from the ancient Greek festival juggler or acrobat who would do amazing feats with their body, who would put on a spectacle, and eventually it became to be applied to someone in the Christic tradition and or a magician who through their relationship with the divine and or their own spiritual power and attainments could make the impossible possible, could make miracles happen, could make signs and wonders occur. And the reason why I put the in training is because while this is something that I've had experience with and something that I've seen, at the end of the day, there's people I look up to who are way further advanced on the path, many
Hmm.
of whom have carved their names into history. And by putting the in training, it means this is a continual pursuit in my life. It's not something
Hmm.
I've attained or arrived at. It's something I'm going to be continuing to aspire and strive to, have. So that's to me, what a taumaturgo is.
Got it. Yeah. Always good to have a little bit of humility along with the outrageous ambition. That makes sense. So, and for others who might be unfamiliar, what is a blurred?
So a blur, that's a funny one. It really reflects like my childlikeness, which is an important aspect of my work. And a blurred is basically a black nerd. So, blurred culture is very big into like gaming, very big into anime and manga, which is like my thing, Marvel superheroes and like all of those things. And a lot of that informs how I allow my work to permeate various aspects of my life. And even when I work with clients and various people, how we can reconnect to those parts of us that have been put to sleep or made dormant. Um, you know, whether it's societal impositions or basically societal agreements we make to say, okay, well, maybe that was for a time when I was a kid, when I had the luxury to be open to these things or whatever it is, maybe, a hard deconstruction process after, some disenchantment, religious disillusionment. Blurred culture for me is a way that we all have, and nerd culture as a whole is a way we all have to access these faculties that are in us and start giving ourselves permission to suspend our disbelief and open to something more.
Hmm. I love that. We could probably have a whole other conversation besides the one that we have plotted today around how that nerdery can be such a lifeline. I know it was for me growing up, like otherwise fundamentalist, but being really into comic book subculture and, superheroes and comic conventions really infused my life with a lot of creativity and play and imagination. So awesome that that is
Yeah,
a
and
core
one
part.
person I would love to mention because you actually have worked with this person and have experience with this person. Jeffrey Kripal has a lot of great resources on tapping into nerd culture as permission for openness to what people might term the impossible or,
Mm.
the supernatural or supernormal.
Yeah, yeah, he certainly does, especially his book Mutants and Mystics. It's like overtly about, yeah, comic books, pulp fiction, science fiction, and the magical and the occult. So good shout out there. Well, so as we continue to dive into these elements of you, where do you orient yourself on the spiritual map with regards to identities like Christian and Catholic? And if we're going to get really fun, how about sorcerer too?
Okay. So for me, when it comes to the word Christian, like obviously, if you follow my work or if you spend a few moments on my profile, you'll hear me or you'll see me shout out saints, talk about like maybe I went to mass and how I have a practice of going to daily mass. But the reason why I identify with Catholicism is because I'm literally doing the practices of Catholicism, albeit in a folk way, albeit in a very, deliberate, my own kind of way. But those practices are there, mass is there, even spiritual direction, confession, um, going to various sacraments, praying novenas as part of how my core part of my magic interfaces with the world. And I would even, lovingly, tongue in cheek, but also seriously call myself a Catholicostal because I very much grew up with my Catholicism and charismatic spirituality very seamlessly interwoven. So to me, it's like a fact. Like Catholicism is a firm part of my life, and that refers to like the sacraments and the system, and also Catholic magic can orient through the systems and practices. So it's almost like calling my saying like I'm Afro-Italian. It's very like woven. Whereas to me, having done my own investigation on the word Christian, how it came about, like the fact that the original followers of Jeshua didn't call themselves that, that was given to them in a, arguably derisive way.
Hmm.
And like having engaged that and having seen what that word has come to mean in the world with a lot of the imperial Christianity that is practiced, it's not something I want to take on myself. Um, Especially because like, if you follow the work of like Neil Douglas Klotz or like, some people might not like, but like Elaine Pagels, who I think has done good work. Um, Bert, I think is Bert Ehrman, or is it Bart Ehrman or Bert
Yeah,
Ehrman?
Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman, yeah,
Yeah.
like in various scholars who have looked at the landscape of what was happening in the early Jesus movement after Jeshua transition, resurrected, however you want to see it. There were various factions and a whole bunch of different streams of thought and belief systems. And I wish what had happened in Hinduism and what had happened in Judaism, where you have various schools of thought that don't all agree, but acknowledge that they are, in fact, various schools of thought, not necessarily the right way, had happened in the Christian tradition. But instead, due to Constantinian influence and due to, the desire to streamline the Christic tradition into one thing, these various groups began to vie and fight for supremacy and eventually what we think of as orthodoxy, not Eastern Orthodoxy, but meaning orthodoxy, uniformity
Mhm.
of belief, correct belief, right?
Yeah.
Correct, all of that. Um, you know, that's what we know today. And so for me, I engage with that tradition. It's a part of me, but it's not something I want to take on or identify. And I also acknowledge that the word Christian has deep meaning for a lot of people, including people I love and care about.
Mhm.
It's something they've taken on. Some people have reclaimed it and redeemed it. They are progressive. I totally respect and honor all of that. It's just not for me.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you, you identify more closely with the term Catholic, not even
Yep.
as an aspirational way, but just as a descriptive way that like a lot of what you're doing is doing Catholicism, albeit in a very, specific and unique way. Whereas
Yeah.
Christian is like such this broad term that carries more baggage for you than it's worth holding on to.
No, exactly. And I think, saying like, if someone asked me, like, Joel, what's your core religion? What is the religious system that all your various practices or whatever are funneled through, even if they belong to other traditions, even if there's like, they're not even, anywhere near the Christian pantheon. My foundation is this Catholicostal folk magic. It's praying novenas, speaking in tongues, taking communion every day. Like these are things that anchor me and keep me rooted in the various safeguards and various things that people need to have if they're going to engage in this work. And it almost is like a trunk of a tree, and all my other practices are branches.
Mhm.
Now, you mentioned a few other things. Oh yeah, Christian, Catholic, and then
Mhm.
sorcerer. So
Yeah.
when it comes to the word sorcery, for me personally, I want to actually talk about like something Jason Miller said, why he uses that word for himself, and then I'll talk about why you could use that word to fit me, but it doesn't fit me. Like I don't take it on personally. But basically, Jason talks about how ceremonial, like magic and witchcraft, for him, sorcery is basically in between, and where you can be a magician and be interested only in spiritual growth. And basically, you can be a witch and only be interested in like religious practice. But for him, being a sorcerer means you are affecting or affecting and influencing, minds and events. And that's basically the goal. So a sorcerer is focused on results. Now, obviously, practical magic, being able to create change on my or in my clients and loved ones' behalf is very important to me. But the reason why I use Tamaturgo is because there is the element of my relationship with God being an important thing. So it is, if anything, it's a devotionally magio religious or magio religious practice, and devotion is an important part of it. It's not something I just do just to get something. You know what I mean? Not saying that sorcerers even, there's a lot of sorcerers with devotional practices, but thaumaturgia for me has an important element of, okay, in my relationship with God, these things also develop. It kind of reminds me of like, what Paul says in like First Corinthians 14, if I can
Mhm.
go to that book that a lot of us have various relationships with, but
Mhm.
basically where he says, pursue love, right? And eagerly strive, or eagerly basically lust, eagerly desire, earnestly desire spiritual gifts,
Mhm.
earnestly desire spiritual manifestations. Ever since I heard that from like, this is gonna be a blast from the past for a lot of people, but like Todd White and Dan Moeller and like some of these different people, that stuck with me. Like that understanding that, wow, that word literally, it's like pursue love and seek power, which is very different than some Eastern traditions, where in Eastern traditions, cities are seen as distractions to enlightenment by a lot of people, not necessarily the Mahasiddhas, but a lot of various people who are, seeking to become enlightened or seeking to become, have some unitive experience with the divine, and then, you know, poof on out of here. Those are seen as like, oh, just natural phenomena that happen that you're supposed to let go of. But Paul basically encourages his followers, however you feel about Paul, he encourages and says, hey, listen, pursue love. So have the spiritual development, the spiritual maturity, the spiritual embodiment necessary, and be power, like pursue power so that love can express into the world. And I think both are important. So,
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And just want to say, you've been throwing out so many names in this conversation so far. I just encourage listeners to Google anybody that sounds interesting because we've been talking about Neil Douglas Klotz, Elaine Pagels, Bart Ehrman, Jason Miller, Todd White, people from very different streams. And if you're not a part of any of the particular weird niches that Joel and I might be part of, and highly amphibious yourself, then you might have no idea who on earth we're talking about. But it's not necessary to follow the conversation, but it's kind of fun that you're just throwing out all these wildly different people into the mix here. Um, so yeah, well let's move on to like one of the big things because this conversation I'm calling it on magic, Jesus, and holy hijinks. So can you tell us how you personally define magic and what makes your approach? You've already alluded to the some, but what makes your approach distinct or grounded in the sacred?
Okay, yeah. So for me, I've came across an anthropological definition of magic that I wholeheartedly resonate with, and it was by a guy named Ronald Hutton. And basically, he defines magic as the application of beliefs, rituals, or actions employed in the belief that they can manipulate natural or supernatural beings and forces. Now, I know that a lot of us have a negative connotation with the word manipulate. So if that makes you uncomfortable, you can substitute in effect or influence. And some people, with this definition, you might realize, and if you do, like kudos, because that's where I'm going. If you've ever prayed or put positive thoughts towards an intended outcome, then you have done a form of magic, maybe rudimentary, but it's still a form of magic. So that's how I define magic. It's a very broad thing. You're basically using, again, uh, beliefs, rituals, and actions to change reality in some way. And so for me, I don't know about my practice being distinct. If I had to basically say, I think it would be the fact that it is very predicate on engaging a childlike relationship with the divine,
Hmm.
and very predicated and founded on opening to awe, opening to wonder, and a practice of continually engaging that to push me, to push my clients, to push various loved ones beyond our limits so we can open to what's possible. Now, I'm sure there's other people that do that, but that's something that I would say is distinct about my practice. And then how it's founded upon the sacred is for me, uh, God or the divine isn't a very important part of that because to me, magic is about agency. Magic is about power, right? And so the power of the practitioner, the power of various beings that either are in the practitioner's way or that the practitioner's petitioning to help, um, and then the power of power itself, like force, energy, various things that exist in the world. Whereas to me, God, when you engage with God, there's a sense of opening. There's a trust. There's a I don't want to say total passivity, but there's a receptivity, and oftentimes mysticism, which is more the realm of God, more transcendence, more the unitive, and magic have been treated as polarities, and sometimes incidental neighbors. And I think for me, both of them are important. I actually had a way. There's something I tell my clients, which is there's three different modes, and depending, these are different from the modes we'll get into later, but there's three different modes, and basically depending on what your goals are, you might land on one of these. But one is that the mystic says to God, "Your will be done." The magician says to reality, "My will be done."
Hmm.
And the thaumaturgo says, "Our will be done."
Hmm.
Meaning, it's a it's kind of like I want my cake and I want to eat it too kind of mentality.
Hmm.
If I could be so audacious and so weird like that, but it's basically like, oh, I want to have this relationship where God's will is done, this quote unquote sense of a higher good is done, but at the same time, I want what I want. and I want all of it to come into concordance. And that is definitely a path with more tension because the other two are very more focused and streamlined. So,
Yeah, I love that. One of my favorite books is by this Hebrew, like Jewish Bible scholar named Richard Elliott Friedman. And two different editions exist. One is called The Hidden Face of God, and the other edition is called The Disappearance of God. And he makes this interesting point that there's this really intriguing passage in the Hebrew Bible where this is a rough paraphrase, but basically God is saying of these Hebrew tribes, I'm going to leave them alone for a little while and see what their fate may be. And the way that Friedman interprets this is it's a kind of mystical responsibility or a collaborative relationship that God is initiating with God's people, that rather than actually being abandonment, it was like creating a little bit of space for actual collaboration, actual um, creation. And so,
mhm.
yeah, this idea of our will be done reminds me of that. And I think that so many folks who are either like steeped in Abrahamic religion or have rejected it have a belief that we're always meant to stay in this like early childhood stage of faith, as opposed to childlike, but childhood where everything is dictated, by the parent. There's like a high amount of structure and guidance. And, I think that as we continue to grow and change and evolve, that God, the divine, does want us to develop our own will, our own desires, and then to exist in a collaborative relationship. So I love that.
No, for sure.
Yeah. And so one thing that I love about my readers and listeners, and I love many things, but one thing I love is that they come from such a wide variety of spaces. Like I imagine there are folks tuning in right now who are active Christians who are involved in probably progressive or at least moderate faith communities who have, feels like a functional relationship with their faith. On the other hand, have a lot of post Christians, ex Christians, or certainly ex evangelicals who have, put some distance necessarily for their own sanity and well being from the religion that they grew up in. And some of those folks are deeply engaged in other forms of spirituality. Still others might be highly skeptical. They've said, a lot of religion and spirituality, no matter what the name is on it, seems like it's ripe for delusion, for manipulation. I want nothing to do with it. And I think that even many of my listeners are some complicated intersection of those three things. And so, for folks coming from any number of these backgrounds who are hearing terms like magic or spirits or even saints, if they happen to be Protestant and have had, or ex-Protestant, kind of had a weird, like, why would we bother with intermediaries like that? So when they hear these words, they might be feeling curious, but also cautious and maybe even a little afraid. So what would you say to the skeptics, to the hesitant, to, people that want to lean in, but they're just not sure?
Well, man, a lot of good stuff in there. So the first thing I'm actually going to work backwards. I'm going to work from the saint thing first.
Okay.
So not to get into like a huge nuanced theological and philosophical discussion because that we could just have a call just on saints themselves and why.
Right. Yeah.
But what I would say to that is very simple. If you've ever asked a friend or a loved one or a family member to help you in any way, if you believe in the concept of community, what a saint is basically essentially a communal ancestor. It comes from the Greco-Roman hero cults
Mm.
and also ancestral veneration practices from every culture around the world where there's this concept called the mighty dead. It's this idea that when we pass over, um, we continue. And depending on how we lived our lives, depending on our relationship to our communities, we may become invested with the power to actually influence reality and to lend a helping hand or, a divine interventionist hand to people that petition us who are seeking our help on their behalf. So that's what I would love to say about saints. That's it's a concept that we have. It's a concept that a lot of us exist in various cultures, and just think of it as, hey, this is a community member, this is someone, this is a communal ancestor. And also it's this fact that a lot of times, for many people, God is very abstract. God is very distant, especially if you've deconstructed, if you have gone on a journey where, God maybe is more the ground of all being. Maybe you're connecting to a supra personal aspect of God. It can be very difficult to be like, well, how do I even connect with that? A saint is an individual who has basically opened to and attained a certain kind of dialogue with that. And in the way where you would go to your grandma and say, hey, grandma, maybe pray for me. It's a similar kind of thing. So again, that's a whole discussion that we don't have time to get into right now, but that's like a
Sure.
very minute thing. And as far as like magic, I think just want to say magic to a lot of people because of their associations with what they may deem to be magic, which is like, maybe the witch in a pointy hat or, maybe someone casting spells, and it is all that. Um, but magic is, again, very simply the craft of applying beliefs, rituals, and actions to basically affect natural and supernatural forces and beings. And again, there's so many things that fall into that. Now, I want to speak to skeptics. Number one, don't believe a word I say blindly. Like, I totally honor everyone having the ability and the agency to make up their own minds. Honestly, if I hadn't grown up the way that I have, if I haven't had the experiences that I have, if I haven't seen magic prove magic self to me time and time again, in obnoxious, redonkulous ways, I'd probably be sitting where you are. I totally understand that Western society and the Western mental milieu has basically conditioned us a certain way to see certain cultures, certain practices as primitive, as antiquated, and there's quote unquote hierarchical and quote unquote white supremacy ways that also play into that. There's a whole lot of things that have like added to that, and there's also genuine, like I would say, people are right. There is the ability for culty and high control behaviors in religion because of the power that it elicits, the power that it can evoke. There is the potential for that in spiritual practices, but think about it this way: we have billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of people throughout history, many of whom were, from cultures outside the US and Europe, right? And many of whom were from cultures in the US and Europe who were like, hey, spirits are real. They do stuff. Magic is real. It does stuff. The idea that a tiny sliver of the human population that has ever lived has been more right than everybody who's ever lived, right? And has receipts, case studies in medical research in various science experiments, that would be kind of crazy, right?
Mhm.
Again, I'm not saying it's crazy to be skeptical. It's not like in it's understandable and people have a reason to, and like you should be look at everything critically, especially if you hadn't had experiences. The only thing I would challenge you is if you do want to know if it's real, go in the world and find it. And there's places where you can find these things happening. Yeah, you could, there's plenty of books and of people who've documented this, and all the information is out there. So that's one thing I would say. Now, to those who are scared of magic and these things, um, Jesus is a very magical dude. I mean, there's no real way. Like, if you believe in Jesus, right? How, whatever that means to you, whether you see him as, the Son of God, God incarnate, whether you see him as, a ascended master, whatever that means, whether you see him as a elevated communal ancestor, however you relate to him, there's no way getting around the fact that, at least according to his followers and according to the words that are attributed to him, magic and the supernatural wasn't was as breathing, as living, breathing, and walking for him. And that's a core part of his message. So don't be afraid of that, because again, look at how I've defined magic, but challenge yourself. I mean, the dude talked to Moses and Elijah. Some people would call that necromancy. You know, the people cast out demons and bound them. The dude cursed the fig tree. And he said, anything that I have done, whoever believes in me, and according to other translations, whoever believes like me, whoever trusts in reality, how I do, will do these things I've done and greater. That is a pretty powerful thing. And I don't feel like a lot of us fully wrap our heads around what that means and the implications.
Mm. Yeah, you said a lot there, and we could go down any one of those rabbit holes more, but I'm going to let that stand as is because this is a conversation and not a seminar that's half day long. But it's a good segue to, part of what you were saying when you were addressing skeptics is like, I totally get it. And if I hadn't been raised the way I have with the experiences I've had, I would probably be skeptical too. So yeah, for those who are not familiar with you, Joel, you talk openly in your various writings, reflections, webinars about your Italian roots, about your West African lineage, and of course about your Catholic upbringing, which we've touched on a little bit here. So, how have these threads braided together to shape the magical work that you do today?
Yeah, well, I was born in San Giovanni Rotondo, which is a tiny little town on the spur of Italy's boot. And San Giovanni Rotondo is really only famous for two things, and these two things are highly interconnected. The first is a man by the name of Padre Pio. Padre Pio was an Italian taumaturgo, not in training, taumaturgo straight up, who could was said to have been able to bilocate. He bore the stigmata, meaning he had the miraculous or mystical wounds of Christ that manifested on his body. He was known for all kinds of healings, miracles. Oh yeah, I should probably explain what bilocation is. So bilocation is a mystical, supernatural or paranormal, supernormal, however you want to define it, phenomenon that basically means someone is able to materialize another body or several other bodies and be in multiple places at once. And they're seen by others. Sometimes they're even touched by others. Sometimes they can even eat food or drop objects behind. And in fact, there's a crazy story of this priest named Domenico da Chiesa, who was a spiritual son of Padre Pio. And it's so much so that anytime people would travel 200, I think it was either 200 kilometers or 200 miles. It was long from Manopello to San Giovanni Rotondo to see Padre Pio. He would almost like jokingly make fun of them and say like, "Why did you come out to see me? My son is out there and he can do everything I can do." And this dude, when Padre Pio's funeral happened, he everybody knew that he was in Manopello. He was in the church grounds and he was there just praying and doing this thing. We have video of him walking in the funeral procession, and it's
Well,
him. It's not like a priest that looks like him, it's him. And there are multiple accounts of, we know this guy, like I saw this guy, I talked to him. He was in Manopello like the whole time. So that's by location. Padre Pio was set to do that many times. There's amazing stories of that. And so for me, I grew up in a family that to them would just say, "Hey, we just go to church, we just pray, we just know God is real." And in the culture I've been in, where my family's from, and in many places around the world, Catholicism and you know Christian spirituality, as they would understand it, is very real. Because there's still a permission in the consensus reality for these things to be seen as normal and as interwoven seamlessly with the fabric of everyday life. Whereas in Western culture, we basically see these things as, okay, I have permission to open up to these things when I'm watching a horror movie or when I'm watching a Marvel movie or when I'm watching, a fantasy movie or a fantasy series or anime. That's when I have permission to engage with this reality. But like once I'm done, I got to put the toys away and go back to the world is a machine. I am a, you know, firing set of neurons driving a meat suit on a floating rock in the sky. That's still miraculous,
I was gonna say that sounds pretty
but
cool too,
it,
actually.
it, it is cool. It is dope. It's cool. But like that's where it ends basically, as
Mhm.
opposed to, yeah, you're all those things. And there's some other wild, redonkulous stuff going on too.
Totally. Love that. Well, so yeah, you speak with saints, you laugh with angels. What is the first memory that you have of the unseen making itself seen in your life?
So this is an early memory that sticks out to me. When I was like 6 to 8 years old, and we had moved to the U.S. from Italy. My mom would go decorate. She would go to this church to decorate the statues of the saints. She would put like flowers, and she that was something she did out of her devotion. This was not something that she was like paid for. It was something that she just did. And so when she did that, she would leave me in the pews and basically say, oh, okay, like pray, talk to Jesus, do your thing. And I would. And one day I'm sitting in the front pew, right? And I'm basically looking up this statue of this risen Jeshua in some church in Connecticut. And as I'm there, I'm just chilling. And all of a sudden I'm looking up and the statue has this like very wide lifelike smile and is looking at me with these like very lifelike eyes
Mm.
and is like, and I can see the statue breathing, and I'm like, ma, Jesus está movendo, Jesus está movendo, Jesus is moving, Jesus is moving. And she said, que bello, like that's beautiful. And then she went right back to doing what she was doing. So she did two things that I think are important. And I want to highlight this for like highlight some developmental stuff. She affirmed the experience and then she normalized it.
Mm.
And that's how my family was with a lot of things. This was normal. God is real, the supernatural is real, the divine is real, and it is what it is, you know. So that's one experience that to this day it has permeated my relationship with Jesus, Jesu, Jeshua, and the supernatural, as well as how I approach people in there and help them and develop and connect in their own way.
Mm. I love that. It actually reminds me of an experience that the late Jean-Paul Dennis Kelly, this Zen American Zen Roshi and like figure in the counterculture movement, apparently had at a Hindu temple once in this deep state where suddenly the statues came alive. They were dancing. He had no category to put it in, and it wasn't a private experience. Like all of the people he was with were also witnessing that, and so. Whew, yeah, reality so much weirder and more fun than we tend to think it is. Um, yeah, well, let's talk about animism for a moment. Animism is a term that in my world has certainly become in vogue in recent years. I think a lot of people from a variety of spiritual backgrounds who are wanting more of a felt sense of connection to the world around us and a break from the dehumanization of Western Enlightenment thinking that has an I-it relationship with reality, that sees so many things as these inanimate inert its, and therefore that we can use them and exploit them accordingly. And animism has come as an alternative perspective, a way of seeing what also some people call panpsychism, that all of reality has some measure of consciousness and that we can actually relate to all of reality, to the seasons, to the trees, to, ancestors in an I thou kind of way, that everything is living and around us. And I think of like a podcast that's very popular, at least in the mountains of Asheville where I live, The Emerald with Josh Schrei, where he goes into a lot of practical animism. But it seems to me that in many traditional African religions, animism is simply the way the world is. So, what do you wish that more Western folks understood about this way of seeing?
Yeah, so first thing I want to say is I am not initiated into any African traditional religions because in those communities and people I know, people I'm friends with, people I love, that's taken very seriously. And so I would say that definitely have gleaned a lot from like African and Afro-Diasporic spiritual practices. But I'm speaking of African traditional religion as someone who is adjacent, someone who's a neighbor, someone who is like in community, but
Mhm.
not an expert and not a priest or anything like that. I just want to make that clear because
Cool.
to listeners or whatever.
Got it.
So to me, the reason why I think that is because again, Africa and the Afro-diasporic places, just like a lot of places in the world, had a different experience of modernization than the Western world did because their thing was not in reaction necessarily the same way that basically the Western world, post-Newtonian or Enlightenment, Newtonianism, like all of these things was in reaction in many ways to the church. And in many ways, the church's first casualty were many of the pagans, you know what I mean, or the indigenous European practices, or all of these things. There was a tension and conflict between that, so that thing didn't occur in the same way. And so these practices were seen as a very normal part of everyday reality. There's still people that engage those things and interact with them. And that's why I think there's that permission, there's that this is normal. And again, like, in various practices, I mean, in various traditions, there's the concept of ashe with the Yoruba, you know what I mean? There's the concept of that there's a spiritual force that permeates everything, that has the power to make things happen, that is permeates rivers, rocks, all of these different aspects of reality. And again, when you have that sort of interaction, as opposed to in many Christian religions or Christian expressions, where it's seen as God is here, the world is here. Uh, and anytime that God wants to intervene, God is not interwoven in the world. God is coming in and basically breaking the world to enact God's will, and God then is removed from the world. This is not how a lot of these pantheonic animistic systems see reality. They see it all as an interweaving and a flowing together that I think is different. So those are my thoughts on why.
Yeah, absolutely. The secularization and de-enchantment that has happened in Western modernity that in some ways, yeah, started with some expressions of Christianity, especially Protestant. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How where you come from, there's more of a seamless garment where those realities get to play together, as they should,
Yeah.
in my opinion, as they
And
should.
that's not just present in African stuff. That's also Italy has a lot of that as well. And there's many parts of Europe, like for example, like in Italy, you have, Benedicaria, you know what I mean? Like you have that in Sicily. You have a lot of, again, because Italy had the Italo-Roman people before even the Romans got there had a very animistic system. So, and
Mm-hmm.
having interacted with that and seen, that's why the concept of saints is able to interweave very seamlessly in a lot of parts of the world, especially Europe, because this folk religion, these saints basically became stewards of various animistic domains, and things
Mm-hmm.
kind of blended together in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Similar with, Celtic expressions of Christianity and how they're kept alive today by communities like Iona and Lindisfarne and Corrymeela. Absolutely.
Hmm.
Hildegard von Bingen, of course, being another, woman saint who's very connected with the sense of viriditas, the fecundity of the natural world and those animate forces, and herbalism, what, many then and now might consider to be witchcraft. So yeah, so many beautiful points of continuity. Well, we've been talking about continuity, but I want to now talk about distinguishing marks because in your work, you distinguish between religion, spirituality, and magic. So, what do you see as the unique focuses of each of these domains, and how can they play nicely together?
Yeah, so basically, for me, religion, it has an aim of right relationship with reality. Spirituality has the aim of direct experience of reality, and magic has the aim of power to change or power over reality. And I'm not talking about these in good, bad, right, or wrong. I'm just talking about these as far as like experientially, what do I see these being about? And a lot of times these things are collapsed together. They're often overlapping, coinciding, intersecting. But it is important to make the distinction because depending on what the goals are of somebody, they can think that they're looking for something. Like, for example, someone could be like, I prayed for so and so, and it did, they either like passed away or they remained sick or like something happened. They had a magical goal and are using the tools of religion to get there, which is fine. Magio religious practice exists for a reason. But in order to troubleshoot, if for example, if someone's like, I'm trying to get right with God, and then says, I'm going to do magic to do that, again, that's fine, but you got to understand what's the goal you're trying to achieve.
Hmm.
And I often, and shout out to my dude, Alexander Moore, the Hex Doc, because he specializes in this, is helping people troubleshoot their magical results. And you need to understand the tools that are right for the job and how you get there.
Absolutely. No, those are very helpful distinctions. So, in the midst of all of your different, I'm going to call them composted backgrounds, whether it's, Roman Catholicism, Afro-Diasporic spirituality, the charismatic movement, how do you experience Jesus now? Do you experience him as a living presence, a magical force, an ancestor, a brother? Yeah, what's your experience of Jesus or Yeshua now?
Yeah, so for me, that's a very good question. To me, Joshua is a real dude, like in the sense like there, and I oscillate sometimes, but depending on which part of the Christic tradition, what does it mean for him to be the son of God, right? Does that mean he's exclusively God? Does it mean he was a forebearer? Does it mean he was someone who knew who he was? Did that happen during his life? There's a lot of stuff that like there's thoughts I may have at any given time. There's things that have stayed consistent. There's things that expand. But here's what I go back to. He has been someone who has proven his reality to me via intervening for my life, intervening on my family's lives, intervening for my clients' lives, and, you know, showing that he is real, right? And so for me, the dogma of who Jesus is, the theory, right? The various thoughts on who he is, I almost have to put that to the side and be like, okay,
Hmm.
what do I feel like I can say if someone like, not to be dramatic, but if someone put a gun to my head, right, and was like, "Hey, yo, what do you really believe?"
That's
I know that might
that's every evangelical's fantasy, by the way. So many movies
I,
were made about
I
it.
know, I know.
What
I
do
just
you
realized
believe?
exactly. But if I was in that scenario, I'd be like, look, I could say there was a dude named Joshua, right? He did miracles. He taught amazing things about reality. He rose from the dead. Now, my understanding of what that means is I do believe he dematerialized his body and entered into a glorified state, similar to what the rainbow body is in a form of Tibetan Buddhism, but not exactly the same, but comparable.
Hmm.
And he left behind a mark on the Shroud of Turin. Now, I know I just dropped a lot of stuff that people are gonna be like, "What the fuck, Joel?" Like, like unpack that. That's a whole discussion.
Yeah.
But and he is someone who I interact with. I have since I was a kid. He's been around my family before I was born. Long before I was born, and he's just a part of my life. So I think to me, that's who Jesus is. And I think his challenge to everybody is the same challenge it was in one of the gospels. Who do you say I am? Now, people took that to mean just because Peter got the kudos, right? Or it was written as having the kudos that, oh, he has the right answer. But it
Hmm.
wasn't about having the right answer in my reading of it. It wasn't
Hmm.
about having the right answer. It was about having the right answer for what Jeshua was showing and
Hmm.
what Jeshua was revealing. And
Hmm.
to me, it's Jeshua has revealed himself to me in a very personal way. Um, and I believe that he wants to do that for everybody, but the answer is not all going to look the same because we're all different people. And at some point, when we try to synthesize and harmonize and create synthetic artificial uniformity, that was when this thing we call Christianity went off the rails, and we
Hmm.
haven't recovered, you know.
Yeah. I love that. For it wasn't so much that Peter had the right answer, but he was in right relationship, and that what he was responding to was a living connection
Hmm.
with him in that moment. And it reminds me, some people at least claim that, the term orthodoxy, which I guess it makes sense when you break it down, the etymology simply means right glory. And the Catholic writer Henry Nouwen claimed that, theology in Eastern Orthodox understanding was simply union with God in prayer. And so you have the idea that there's this vital link that is what is real. It's really resonant for me. And I think that you actually have something that is the envy of many evangelical believers, and especially Pentecostal and charismatic believers, in that you have an actual living relationship with Yeshua that includes like dialogue, that includes hearing from. And in a moment, we're going to talk about an upcoming online gathering you have where, among other things, you will be sharing some of like the practical how to's of just such an I thou regular routine encounter with Yeshua, with, saints and spirits. But before we get to that, I have one more question, which is how can we leverage our deconstruction to receive more of what we want in life? Because so many of us have deconstructed our beliefs, and some of us have experienced that as empowering, others of us have experienced it as traumatic. So, how do we leverage our deconstruction to receive more of what we want in life?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I think for me, my goal in deconstruction was I want my relationship with God to be limitless. In that I had an experience where, and actually, I wasn't even planning to share this, but this is actually relevant, it just came to my mind. So I remember a moment before my deconstruction fully happened. I was like teetering on the edge. I was like deconstructing certain things, and I was on a path to become very influential in the charismatic church as almost like an accepted heretic.
Mm,
Actually, I've never even told you this.
yeah, I don't know that I've heard it
And
quite
and
like this
and
before.
and I basically had certain pastors and big name teachers connected to people you would recognize that I won't mention on the record. But basically, I was getting ready to write a book. I had 200 some pages written on Word.
Hmm.
It was going to be on like, walking in the supernatural, having this relationship with Jeshua, operating in the prophetic, like all of these various things. And I remember Jeshua coming to me in a conversation and said, Joel, you have two roads ahead of you. One road, you can basically keep going here, you will find great success. People will, you'll have an audience, people will resonate with everything or a lot of things that you say, and ultimately, you'll be stable. You'll be able to still be the, rabble rousing heretical voice within reason in your environment. You'll be respected, but there will be a ceiling. You won't be able to fully open to what's possible because you will have a line you won't cross. And not to say you won't be happy, but that yearning you have to see the impossible, to see God as you can see God in your unique relationship, that door will be closed. Door number two, and I was like, all right, what's door number two? Door number two is basically you allow me to take you through a time of letting your beliefs, your thoughts, your perceptions to be shaken, where you enter into a time where it will be very uncomfortable and you will question everything, even me. And in that time and through that time, you will eventually open to the possibility of what you want, which is everything and anything being possible. That door will open. You may lose some things that you felt were your supports, even things that you felt were essential parts of you. But at the end of the day, what you want will be available to you. And he said, I'm not telling you what to choose. And I chose door number two. I just realized that when I was saying this, that Jesus was kind of like a Morpheus type figure saying, with a red pill, blue
Yeah,
pill,
I was gonna say it sounds like maybe he was putting his thumb on the scale a little bit, like, don't you want door number two? But I hear you. He was ultimately respecting your own agency there.
No, exactly. But that after that conversation was like, look, this is what I want. That took me through, on this path of deconstruction and reconstruction. And I'm not gonna lie, like that shit was scary in a lot of points because you feel like, wow, a reference point, things that I took for granted
Hmm.
are wobbly and liquefying.
Mm.
And who am I even? But what I found through that experience is because I had the reality of the supernatural so just take so established in my life, I could always come back to look. I don't even know what I fully believe right now, but I know there's something. And I know this something is capable of working wonders. And I know that I'm somehow connected to this and us as humans are somehow connected to this. Let me keep going. And
Mm.
eventually I did come back to certain things and they just reintegrated in a different way under a different authority. So I would just, to sum all that up, I would just tell people in your deconstruction and reconstruction journey, if you have a desire, like for example, if you do have a desire to have the supernatural in your life, or if you have a desire to have peace, or if you have a desire to, be free of certain shame from purity culture, whatever it is, hold on to that desire. And wherever your deconstruction journey uh, takes you, orient yourself with that desire in mind. Make sure that that's guiding all your questions because we're often taught through our, programming in, church or upbringing or whatever it is to not be advocates for what we want, where what we want is something that we almost have to push down and hope that somehow it comes to us incidentally or by as a byproduct so we don't look like bad people for going for what we want. And that suppression and repression creates a lot of havoc. It's better to be honest with ourselves, or it's better for me to be honest with myself about what I want and hold that, take it to God and let God and be like, God, look, you might want this. I want this. How do we harmonize this?
Mm. Mm. Yes, that is a very unusual but time-honored biblical way of relating with God. Yeah, hashing it out, arguing. Abraham did it. It
Hmm.
happens. Well, man, we could talk about a lot more, and I literally do have a half dozen more questions that I had already written out, which just tells me that we need to do this again. But in the meantime, in closing, tell us about this upcoming gathering you have. Fun is Risen. Like, what are you inviting us into? What kind of magic are you conjuring? And why do you believe this convocation could be life changing for somebody tuning in?
Well, this specifically came to mind because of two various groups of people. One is the people who are in my magical community who maybe have worked with saints a little bit, have worked with angels or want to, but have had significant church trauma and church baggage. And obviously, at the center of that is Jesus and the person of Jesus. And so I was like, this will help you to boost your work in a very results oriented way by helping you heal and clear, uh, or at least putting you on the path to do that with this central figure who's basically the head of that pantheon. So that was one aspect. And the other aspect is I also have Christians, who contact me because, they're like, Joel, you're into some stuff. Maybe it weirded me out a little bit, but you love Jesus
Mhm.
and I need some results, right? And so there are Christians that are magic curious, right? That want to get into spooky stuff, but maybe feel like it might be a betrayal to Jesus, who they love and who they respect. And that is also going to be addressed there. And then, of course, for me, talking about something that I alluded to in this conversation, which is it's less important about the dogma of how we choose to answer Jesus' question of who do you say I am, but it's more important about the fruits that our connection with Jeshua is producing in our lives and in the world, and what who he reveals himself to be in and through our lives. And so I want to really engage that. And then at the end, because I always do this, there will be a time for actually letting the resurrection power of Jeshua, letting the power of Holy Spirit to actually touch people and to move through, and we're gonna release certain outcomes that people want to see happen. And I don't know fully what's going to happen, but we're going to end with like a sort of group ritual. So
Mm.
that's essentially what we'll be addressing.
Right on. And when is this?
This is going to be April 18th at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time. And I did that so like my, Pacific time folks can also attend, and it's Good Friday. So like there's definitely intention
Mm.
behind that. And one last thing I want to say about this is when I asked Joshua, okay, what do I tell people about like this class, this inspiration for this came about, like what do you want people to know? And what I felt like I heard was tell them I'm fun. Like tell them I'm not a buzzkill.
Mm.
Like tell them I'm not trying to stop them from enjoying their lives. I actually want to contribute to that.
Mm.
And that to me is at the heart of Fun is Risen, because too many times we have taken the cross, which was an important part of Jeshua's life. I'm not discounting that, but it was a sliver. There was a dude who was hanging out with sex workers, called a wine bibbler and a glutton, multiplied food, made the most banging wine ever. You know what I mean? At the time, people were freaking out. Like, was a partier, loved life so much that he came back to do it again. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So that to me is the heart that has become lost in a lot of ways for various reasons, because we've emphasized the suffering and de-emphasized the feasting.
Mhm.
Jesus's followers, when he was alive, was asked, "Why do your disciples not fast?" Right? And he answered, "Well, how can people fast when the bridegroom is with them? When the bridegroom is taken from them, they will fast." Now, according to Christian, tradition, you correct me if I'm wrong, Michael. I'll leave it to you. Um, but according to the tradition, we have him again. He came back. Yes, he quote unquote ascended, but he didn't leave us orphans according to,
Mhm.
Christian tradition. He sent the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Why are we fasting as the only thing we're doing? Why are we, yes, the world is the world. Yes, things are the way they are. But if he truly is risen, right, whatever that means,
Mhm.
we should be happy. We should have joy. We should open to a certain kind of reality. And fun is risen. So,
Fun is
yeah.
risen. Okay. So obviously, if people can join live, that would be advantageous because then they'll get to participate in whatever
Yep.
emerges in the group field. But if someone can't join live, can they still register and get access to
Oh
the?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I would encourage people to do that. And there's still I've had many people who have not been able to attend live, and there are things that come through in the recording, and even there'll be a Q&A. So definitely don't let that stop you. And yeah, I look forward to seeing y'all there.
Cool. All right. Well, this is Jo'el Adifon, y'all, in all his radiance, hilarity, and holy fire. So, if this conversation has stirred up something in you, curiosity, confusion, or maybe even awe, I encourage you to simply lean in. Joel's upcoming event, Fun is Risen, is happening soon, and it's going to shape up to be a one of a kind gathering of mystics, misfits, and aspiring miracle workers. So, you can find the link in the show notes, or you can go to bit.ly, that's bit.ly /fun is risen, and come as you are, doubts and all. There's a seat at this kind of table for you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening with your heart. I'll see you next time. And until then, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay gloriously weird.